Continuing our coverage this hour on the political violence in Brazil over the weekend. Brazilian authorities are now vowing to punish the thousands of supporters of ex-President Jair Bolsonaro who stormed the nation's top government buildings yesterday. Many of the protesters who rioted in Brazil's Congress, Supreme Court, and presidential palace say they wanted the army to restore the former right-wing President Bolsonaro and oust the newly inaugurated President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. Joining us now to talk about this political violence in Brazil is Dr. Carlos Eduardo Costa, the professor of political science at Wright State University and an expert in Latin American politics. Thank you so much for joining us, Doctor. Describe for us, if you would, the current political climate in Brazil.
Hi, John. So this violence yesterday, it comes after this very controversial, very turbulent election where, one incoming president is very controversial himself, and he's replacing another very controversial president. So right there we have this very polarizing situation, and both of them are very polarizing themselves, even if in different ways. The incoming president is entering his third term after two very popular terms in the early 2000s. But then, since then, he was arrested. He was convicted of bribery. He had his political rights revoked. He was actually serving time in jail, only to be freed and having his rights reinstated after he was shown that the judge had botched some of the evidence. So, recognizing that these two figures are very controversial themselves, kind of like allows us to see how much of this violence parallels and is similar to what we saw here in January 6th, and then the violence that we saw yesterday.
Yeah, the January 6th happening 2 years and 2 days before what we saw take place in Brazil yesterday. Now, former President Bolsonaro has been promoting the idea that Brazil's election systems were prone to fraud, though he has never provided evidence. We've seen that here. He also never conceded defeat. We saw that here. What responsibility, if any, do you think Bolsonaro has for this violence?
So it's hard to say, because he did peddle all of the narratives that are very similar to what Trump did about all these claims of fraud, but he didn't he didn't promote the violence that took place yesterday. The difference, I think, that protects him in a sense is that he was no longer in power. In fact, he has been self-exiled in Orlando. He's in Florida right now. He's been there since the new year. And it's unclear that he fomented or that he had the actual power to foment the riot yesterday, given that, he's been away from the country. He was away from any position. He didn't have anything to communicate. He's been in the hospital today. He's been said that he's been sick. So it's unclear that he can be said to be the cause of it, at least not in the same way.
Let me ask you this. I apologize for jumping in. We just have a few seconds left. You mentioned Bolsonaro in a hospital reportedly in Florida. What next in Brazil?
Well, I spoke to a lot of people today, and a lot of them, most of them actually, do not buy into the whole electoral fraud narrative, but they do feel, they do condone some of what happened, in the sense that they feel that, much like we feel that our institutions were tarnished by what happened yesterday, they feel that Lula is tarnishing their institutions by being their president. So the road ahead for Brazil is difficult, because the incoming president does not have the credibility that's necessary to bring the country together. Half of the country really feels that instead of being the president, he should be in jail. Yeah. And the future is gloom for them, much gloomer than ours, I think.
Certainly could be a very bumpy road in Brazil. Thank you so much, Dr. Carlos Eduardo Costa, again, professor of political science at Wright State University. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.